Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with James Swanson, the author of The Deerfield Massacre, a surprise attack, a forced march, and the fight for survival in early America. He's written 9 books and is an executive producer of the Apple TV series Manhunt. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The dumb joke about leap years is that anything that happens on Leap Day, February 29th, didn't really happen. Well, in the case of the Deerfield Massacre, that might as well be true as far as we're concerned today. Nearly 50 people were killed, more than 100 were taken hostage, and big parts of the town of Deerfield were burned. Taking place in 1704 as part of the Queen Anne's War, the second in a series of French and Indian wars, a group of French and native fighters attacked an English colonial settlement and then marched the hostages into Canada. But you would never know it. The story has evaporated from our collective memory. So first of all, James, when did you first hear of the Deerfield Massacre?
I heard about the massacre when I spent a summer in Deerfield when I was in college. Historic Deerfield has a wonderful history program for college students every year, and they've done this for the past 60 or 70 years. Every year, they invite 6 to 10 college students to town to live on the street and to study early American architecture, silver, material culture, immigration, Native American topics, gravestone carving, really all aspects of early American life. And so I learned about the massacre when I spent a summer in Deerfield.
When you say to live on the street, you don't mean the street lowercase, you mean the street uppercase, right?
Yes.
Yeah, let's clear that up there. Yeah.
Deerfield has one main street. It's always been called the street with a capital S. And that's the original street of Deerfield from when it was founded in the 1600s. And so, yeah, I don't mean on literally the street.
I just wanted to be clear.
The main street, exactly.
It didn't sound like a very attractive invitation.
Yeah.
You begin the book with a description of Deerfield in the early 1700s. It's about 80 miles as the crow flies west of Boston. What do we, for the purposes of our conversation, need to know about what was happening in North America at that time in this early 1700s, and what was Deerfield's place in those happenings?
Well, it was a time of great international conflict between the great powers of Europe. Queen Anne's War was the War of Austrian secession. It had to do with who would take over the throne of Spain. And that war came across the ocean to North America, where France and England were contending over the control of the entire North American continent. The French had colonized Canada, and the English had colonized New England, Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont. Those states are those colonies. And so the French wanted to control America. They wanted to drive the English out, and the English wanted to drive the French out. And this conflict involved many indigenous tribes: Abnakis, Mohawks, Hurons, Iroquois, Pennacoks, and others. And some of the tribes sided with the English, some of them sided with the French. And that was true for much of New England history, from the time of the Deerfield Massacre in 1704 all the way through the American Revolution. Both great European powers had enlisted native tribes to be their allies. And so that's the context of it. And then, of course, there were other conflicts with the natives and the colonists in New England. The biggest was in 1675, 25 years before the Deerfield Massacre, King Philip's War, when Deerfield suffered terribly during King Philip's War. And there was something called the Bloody Brook Massacre of September 1675, when 70 men from Deerfield, teamsters and colonists and militiamen, were transporting carts of grain to supply English militia who were fighting King Philip and his native allies in King Philip's War. That, incidentally, was the last chance of the Indians to drive the white colonists off the continent. And they couldn't do it partly because they weren't allied enough with each other. But anyway, the 75 Deerfield men were transported transporting the grain, and little did they know this, were lying in wait for them were 1,000 Indians of various tribes who caught them by surprise out in the open and wiped them out. And then for the next 25 years after the King Philip's War, there were constant Indian raids, scalpings, attacks, disappearances, vanishings. So the Deerfield area, Massachusetts, and New England were bedeviled for the next 25 years by random attacks,
Mm.
by stealth, by surprise. And then the rumor came to Deerfield that the French Canadians and their native allies were planning an attack. They were going to come down from Canada and attack. And so in the fall of 1703, Deerfield was on high alert. They had erected their palisade wall 10 feet tall. Most of the population moved inside the fort, and they waited and waited through fall for the attack. It never came. The Indians instead went to Maine, did an attack there. And as winter came, really December, January, and early February 1704, Deerfield let down its guard. The thinking was, well, it's the middle of winter. It's going to be tough for the French and Indians to come down. It's 300 miles from Canada. It'll take them forever to get here. It'll be a difficult journey. I think we're safe for the season, was the attitude of the people of Deerfield. Little did they know that a month before, in early January 1704, the French and Indians started to organize an expedition to Deerfield. And the objective was to wipe out Deerfield, to kill many people, to burn the town, and to take a large number of hostages who would be captured by the Indians and by the Canadians to bring them back to Canada.
Was there a strategic interest in Deerfield? Was there something about the location that made it appealing, or was it just the fact that there were so many people living on the frontier in one place?
Well, Deerfield was the most remote settlement in Massachusetts. It was in northwestern Massachusetts. And so it symbolized the English incursion into the territory. But Deerfield itself was not a valuable prize. Deerfield was not a rich town. About 300 people lived there. There wasn't much cash in town. There wasn't treasure there. These were hardworking people who managed the agriculture and grew crops and who raised livestock. So Deerfield was not a big prize, but it was a symbolic prize because it represented the farthest incursion west of the English colonists to Deerfield. It was not a trading route. It was not an important city, but it was there. It had 300 people, and it was very close to Canada. Deerfield was closer to Canada than it was to New York City. So
Hmm.
symbolically, it was an important English outpost.
The end of your opening paragraph describes the sound of a tomahawk bashing into a door, and you can still see that tomahawk by the, or at least you can see the door. Still very cool. The opening salvo in the Deerfield Massacre. Um, who swung the tomahawk, and what was on the other side of the door?
Well, Indians swung the tomahawk. Certainly some of them were Mohawks, because we know that Mohawks burst into the home of John Williams and murdered two of his children on the front doorstep, smashing their skulls into the stone step. And then John Williams had a slave. There was slavery in Deerfield, not much, but it was there. And his slave Parthena was also murdered by the Indians. And a Mohawk captured John Williams. Other tribes captured his other surviving children. So they captured his wife Eunice, Reverend Williams himself, and his five surviving children after two were murdered at the front door. And then, uh, so certainly it was probably Mohawk who swung that tomahawk into the door. And you mentioned you can see that door today. It's in the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Station
That's
Museum.
unbelievable. Yeah.
And it's known as the Old Indian Door, and it really became the most famous, iconic relic in early New England. It has multiple gashes of the tomahawk and axe blades, and there's a hole cut in the door about 4 by 5 inches, through which one of the warriors was able to shove a musket barrel through that hole and fire it blindly, which happened to be a lucky shot, and it killed the woman inside the house. That house, the Sheldon house, was under siege, but the Indians and French couldn't get in. They couldn't burn it down. They couldn't chop it down. They couldn't break it down by brute force. That door survived, as did the old Indian house. The only reason the house was captured was because there was also a secret, smaller exit door, an escape door in the rear of the house. And one of the occupants was so afraid he ran out the back door and left it open, and the Indians came in and captured everyone in the house. Otherwise, the house could have resisted the raid, and no one in the house would have been taken. And that door became an indestructible symbol of the errand into the wilderness of the English colonists to Massachusetts. It was made of Massachusetts oak, double thick, studded with hundreds of iron nails to chip the tomahawk blades, and that's why it became an important symbol of the meaning of the massacre.
From reading your book, it seems that the Deerfield Massacre sort of faded into history the moment that the continent was changed so radically by the revolution itself. At least that's the impression I got. Maybe, you having studied it would have a different interpretation, but it also says the mindset of those early days on this continent, at least in the scope of American history, were radically changed by the revolution. So take me back to the mindset of people in those early 1700s before the revolution, as you say, before George Washington and John Adams were ever heard of or even born. What were the hopes and dreams and the fears and ambitions of people living in Deerfield, taking it out of the context of the full scope of what was happening on the continent?
Yeah.
In other words, what were they all about?
The people of Deerfield were hardworking, poor people who were to make their way in the world by recreating essentially a replica of an English farming village. They had lots of land assigned to their home lots. Their home lots were all on the main street, and they had land behind the houses where they could raise cattle, where they could grow crops. And many of the people from Deerfield came from other nearby New England towns. Deerfield, in many ways, was the town of some outcasts who had not prospered in other towns or had gotten in trouble in other towns. Very few of the people in Deerfield had come directly from the mother country of England. Instead, they had migrated to Deerfield from other New England towns to make their way. A lot of them were single men. There were some early founding families of Deerfield. And so that's who they were. They were Puritans. Their minister was Reverend John Williams, who came there long before the raid. And so they were simple, God-fearing people uh, who wanted to survive through their labor, through agriculture, through trade, through carpentry, through barrel making, through raising crops. And they were essentially a simple people. Deerfield was not a fort. There were no British soldiers there to protect the people of Deerfield. They were on their own. So these 300 people were on their own. And
Before
that's who the people of Deerfield were.
before we get back to the narrative itself and the raid itself, I just want to ask about you and how you pieced this all together. What was your main challenge in piecing this together? Are there any records from that time period? Are there newspapers? What did you use?
Well, there are some records. The most important record of all is a book written by Reverend John Williams. After he was home from his captivity, he wrote a book called The Redeemed Captive Return to Zion. It's a pioneering book in a genre we call Indian captivity narratives. Mary Rowlandson wrote one after she was captured by the Indians in the 1600s, and Williams was one of the early books. So Williams' book is a combination of several books in one. It's an action adventure book about what happened the night of the raid. He documents who was killed, whose houses were burned, what the Indians did, what they said, how they threatened him, how they killed his children. So it's a very firsthand account of his experiences of that raid and of the march to Canada. It's also a religious tract about the conflict between French Roman Catholics and Jesuits and Puritan ministers, because I liken it to almost the 1950s and the Cold War, the fervor between communism and liberty and American democracy. That's how intense the religious wars were at that time. People weren't thinking, oh, we're all Christians, we're all the similar. There was a hatred between Catholics and Puritans that marred life in early America. And so that was also going on at the time.
Are there newspapers from that time period that survive?
Not from Deerfield.
Yeah, I was going to say, did Deerfield even have a press or anything?
No, Deerfield did not have a printing press at the time. So there are also accounts between some of the other survivors. Reverend William's son, John, Stephen, who survived the raid, wrote a book later, and he had an account of what happened. A few other people published brief accounts of what happened, but no survivor, aside from Williams himself, wrote a full book. It's about a 120-page book, 140-page book. No one but John Williams wrote a book with details about the raid, and the captivity. We learned a lot from colonial sources at the time who had visited Deerfield, who came to Deerfield's rescue, who interviewed and talked to some of the survivors. There were a lot of French records that survive and documents between the French leaders in Canada and the correspondence across the ocean to France itself. One thing is missing from the narrative. written records of the point of view of the tribes. The Mohawks, the Iroquois, the Abnakis, the Penacooks, and others, the Huron, did not write books about the Deerfield Massacre. There was more of an oral tradition of storytelling and memory and objects. And so it was more difficult to retrieve the native perspective on the Deerfield raid.
How much help did you get from, or how much help does it give you to immerse yourself in the Deerfield of today? For a writer, what does that do to stand there and at least say, well, this is the quote, the street. Um, I can kind of view the dimensions of everything and where everything sort of is. Did you find that to be a helpful exercise as a writer?
Oh, yes, yes. The topography and geography of Deerfield was just essential to understand the story and see it how it happened. I've been to Deerfield countless times. Most recently, I was in town for a reunion of some of the Deerfield Fellows, and just before that, I went back for one of the anniversaries, and in February, and reenactors came down from Canada and from the U.S., and they represented some of the tribes. There were 8 or 9 reenactors, and I imagine what it must have been like to see those 8 or 9 multiplied many times, to imagine 300 of them or 350 of them walking through town. And then at midnight, I walked through the town, and there was ice on the ground, a moon, the constellations were in the heavens, coyotes were moaning in the distance, and I walked the whole town at night for an anniversary, and it was so interesting to see because I walked where the houses once stood on the front lawn of the town common. There are boulders that indicate where the Sheldon House was, where the John Williams House was. None of the houses from the raid survive anymore. That's a more modern town from the mid 1700s. And so I walk the town at night. I walk where the old Palisade stood. I walk where the Williams House was, and I walk down to the river, and you can still hear it, which is one way how I end the book. The reality of the geography, you can still hear the gurgling of the river on the banks, and no one knows exactly where the hostages crossed the river on their journey to Canada. But those are the same sounds heard by the Pecumtuck Indians who had that land for several thousand years. And it was very moving to experience that. And then I walked from there to the site of the Meadows fight, where colonists pursued the Indians and tried to rescue the hostages, and there was a bloody fight there. And then I ended the evening by walking to the headstones of John Eunice Williams again. And the headstones really give a few different interpretations of the whole story, because Eunice, who was tomahawked to death in 1704, the day after the massacre, she had given birth a few weeks earlier. She had fallen into the river. She was soaking wet. She was freezing, and someone killed her with a tomahawk. Her gravestone reads, here's the grave of Mrs. Eunice Williams, faithful consort of Reverend John Williams, etc., etc. And then her tombstone says, felled by ye rage of ye barbarous enemy.
Mm.
And John Williams' stone dates from 1729 because he survived the massacre by 25 years. His stone is more peaceful, and it said, here lies the body of Reverend John Williams, uh, good and faithful pastor of this place. And
Has I was
so
gonna, yeah, go ahead, yeah.
that's how I experienced the physicality of Deerfield. And I've seen the old Indian door probably 100 times. I've walked the town many times, and so it makes it more real to me to be in the place. To me, objects and artifacts and places speak. They resonate with a special power, and so that I need to have that feeling and experience that to write a book.
Has anything from their culture of the 1700s carried over to the Deerfield residents of today?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I think so. There are many descendants still in town or in the region. Some of the old Deerfield families still live. You can find a lot of their names in the chamber that houses the old Indian door. There's what I call a wall of cenotaphs, marble carvings that look like tombstones embedded into the wall. And a lot of the old families are still in there. The Nims family, the Arms family, the Sheldon family. A lot of these names still resonate in Deerfield today. Uh, in 1969, a great writer, Bart McDowell for National Geographic, wrote an article called Deerfield Keeps a Truce with Time. And I think that's the most important article ever written about Deerfield in the summer of 1969. And it really captures how the spirit of the old Deerfield still lives today. It passes on through people. One of my favorite characters in Deerfield was a man named Joseph Peter Spang III. And Peter went to Harvard in the old days, and he was the first person hired by Henry and Helen Flint, who created historic Deerfield, this mile-long stretch of historic houses and collections along the street. And he was a classic old New Englander. And Peter knew people from the time he was a boy. He knew people who were descendants of the people in Deerfield at the time. And so through generations, the story of Deerfield and the massacre has been passed down. And also this, on the more recent commemorations, the 300th anniversary and more recent anniversaries, people have come down from Canada. Indigenous peoples and Indians have come down to experience Deerfield themselves and tell stories because a lot of the Williams descendants still are alive today, and they're of native blood and English colonist blood.
Mm.
And so it's really interesting in the way that Deerfield and the massacre lives on in the very bodies and blood and heritage and DNA of many of the people who come down from Canada and visit Deerfield. So the theme of the story is really very much alive, I think, in Deerfield. And when you go back into the Pocahontas Valley Memorial Association Museum, it takes you back 200 years.
Wow.
It's my favorite standalone history museum in America.
I've never been to Deerfield. I've been to tons of cities in the Northeast. That's where I'm from, but I've never been to Deerfield. I'll have to go someday. Um,
Oh, it's a must. You really got to go there.
One more about you, and then we can go to the rest of the narrative here. How did you, as a writer, go from these great chases of these assassins, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray? You've written about, Lincoln, Kennedy, the Martin Luther King assassinations. What brought you from those things into this particular story? Are there parallels to them?
Well, there are. Some of my friends kid me, and they say, "Oh, what bloody massacre are you going to write about next, or what
Yeah.
horrible murder or assassination?" It's not as though I'm obsessed with the death and murder and the blood as much as I'm absolutely obsessed with historic moments of change in American history, where something happens and then everything changes overnight. I think that's what unites my interest in my writing about everything from the Lincoln assassination, the chase for Jefferson Davis at the end of the Civil War, the death of Martin Luther King, the death of John Kennedy, the assassination of Lincoln. I think that theme unites everything I write about. These dramatic moments of unexpected change where America changes overnight. I think that's probably the common thread that runs through my books.
Describe the raid itself now. What happened that night? Who was killed? Who was taken? Who was left behind? Give us the best description that you possibly can, of what those people endured that night.
Yes. Well, the raid started in the middle of the night, probably 3 o'clock in the morning when it was dark. Everyone was asleep. There was one guard stationed to guard the town, walking around in the palisade. No one knows what happened. The alarm wasn't sounded. The myths are he fell asleep listening to a woman singing to her baby behind a window. The myths are that he yelled alarm but didn't fire his musket. There are many multiple myths of what happened. We don't know. Reverend John Williams, in his book, never named the man who was responsible for not giving the warning. So the first warning that they got was the attack on the Williams house, the tomahawks slicing into the door, a window being broken, breaking down his front door. Roused from his bed, he picked up a pistol and tried to shoot an Indian, a Huron, in the chest. The pistol misfired. They disarmed him. They threatened, if you do that again, we're going to kill you. We're going to scalp you. We're going to tomahawk you to death. Then they killed his children at the front door, killed two of them, a newborn child and a very young child. Then they killed Parthena his black woman slave. I'm sure she was trying to protect the children from harm, so they killed her too. And then they bundled Williams up, made him get dressed, made his wife Eunice get dressed, made his 5 surviving children get dressed, and they took them into the street. While that was happening, they attacked other houses along the way. The most famous one, the two most famous ones, were the Sheldon House, the so-called Old Indian House that had the old Indian door, and that's where they laid siege to the house for a few hours, and then crept in through the back way and captured the house. Then there was another house, the Stebbins House, a big house. And by the way, you can see a replica of the old Indian house on the street in Deerfield now. It's quite an exact replica. So it's great to visit that. And the PVMA also runs that. And then the Stebbins house survived the attack. They fired hundreds of flintlock musket shots against the Indians, killed a number of them. The house couldn't be burned down. Now and then, when the Indians got close with torches, someone might open the door of the house and step out and shoot someone carrying a torch. And so the Stebbins house survived the attack. The 15, 18 people in there survived the attack. There was a Nims house up the street, which is now near the PVMA Museum, the old first building of the Deerfield Academy. The Nims family suffered heavily. Their house burned. People were smothered, burned to death in the cellar. They suffered multiple casualties and deaths. And then other people hid out and ran into the forest. They survived. Some people jumped out of windows. So it was a random selection of who survived and who was killed. And so uh, the fires lit up the skies at night so far away that the people of Hatfield saw the sky glowing from miles away, and they knew Deerfield was under attack. So under the code of the old frontier, if that was happening, if you knew neighbors were under attack, you were obligated to mount your horse and go to the danger, not knowing if there were 100 Indians in town or 500 or 1,000, like there were at Bloody Brook. And so they bravely went to Deerfield. And when they arrived, the fight was still going on. People were still fighting in the streets. The Indians were still attacking the Stebbin house, and the rescuers really drove the Indians out of town as they were leaving soon anyway. And the Indians and French took their captives with them. And so it was really a night of great terror because the Deerfield residents were completely taken by surprise. They were awakened in the middle of the night. They weren't dressed. They hadn't loaded their muskets. And so they were doomed to lose the fight. Uh, and so that went on for a few hours, and 49 people were killed on the night of the raid, and 112 people were rounded up to be taken captive to Canada.
And so, what was their goal in doing that? Why did they want to take these hostages with them?
Well, a few reasons. Because, of course, they could have tried to kill everyone in town, but they didn't want to kill everyone in town. They wanted to kill the people who resisted or who couldn't march to Canada. There were multiple motives. Some of the native tribes had a practice called a mourning war, and that's mourning. And under that practice, tribes wanted to replace people who they had lost, either killed in battle, died of illness or disease or old age. So the idea was to capture white New England captives, but especially young people, especially girls and young boys, and convert them to their native ways and make them members of the tribe. Not hold them as slaves, not hold them as captives, make them into Indians who believed their beliefs and who spoke their language. And so they wanted to take living captives to perpetuate their tribes. Then some of the Indians wanted to take captives to sell them back to the English. And the French were interested in that too, to earn money from the captives or trade them with the English for prisoners. So there were multiple motives, depending on tribe by tribe or French or Indian, on why they wanted to take various captives and take them to Canada.
Describe, unfortunately, this death march that took place. I mean, that's a very, we think of that in terms of the Holocaust often. Do you feel comfortable using that term for what was done to the people who were taken from Deerfield?
Yes, because I use the term because it reminded me of the Bataan Death March during World War II, when the Japanese took a number of our captives and slaughtered them on the way. And so, of the 112 people who began what I call the Death March, almost 20 were killed along the way. They killed babies, they killed little children, they killed pregnant women. The question I had always is, why take some of these people captive in the first place if you knew they couldn't make the journey and you'd have to kill them anyway? The natives viewed it as merciful to kill a captive who couldn't make it, rather than leave them to freeze to death or attacked and killed by wild animals. But I would ask, why kidnap a 4-year-old child in the first place if you knew you were going to kill that child on the journey? And so, one of the first to go was Reverend William's wife, who fell into the river, got freezing, and couldn't continue, and she was tomahawked to death. And then another woman on the raid, I remember well, uh, she was pregnant. She was 31 years old. She was in good health. She could have survived, but she fell on the ice, and that caused a miscarriage of her unborn child. And so she sought out Reverend Williams on the march and said, Reverend, I just lost my baby. I fell on the ice. I miscarried. I think they're going to kill me today. Pray with me. Pray for me. And sure enough, they killed her that day, either with a tomahawk or a war club. And so Williams prayed with her and tried to comfort her as best he could. And so that happened throughout this trek to Canada. Uh, if people provoked a member of a tribe, they might be killed. If they tried to escape, they would be killed. If they were too young, they'd be killed. And so 20 people of the 112 were killed along the way on the march to Canada.
Where in Canada were they taken, and then what ends up happening to the people who were taken there? Some people were adopted and wound up living with native families.
Yeah, it depends on it. They went to native villages, they went to Montreal, they went to little Canadian towns. Some of the native tribes had big encampments up in Canada, and they were taken there. The captives were divided. No captive had an identical experience. The French took in a number of the captives and cared for them and fed them. The Indians took in a number of captives to their tribes. The Mohawks took John Williams' 7-year-old daughter, Eunice Williams, who also had her mother's name, Eunice, and that they loved her and wanted to make her into a Mohawk, and they didn't want to surrender her for any amount of money or threat or cajoling. And that's what happened to her. She remained in Canada for the rest of her life. She married a native, and she came back to Deerfield a few times, but she never came home to live with her father again. And so some of the captives converted to Catholicism. Many of the young ones married Indians or joined the tribes. They weren't all put in a prison in one place and locked in behind cells together. They had many different experiences. Stephen Williams, one of John Williams' sons, went on hunting expeditions and adventures with native tribes, and they tried to make him one of them, but inside he resisted and knew he never wanted to become an Indian. So ultimately, when he was returned, he wanted to go back to New England, and so the captives lived different ways. In the early part of the raid and the march, one person escaped the night of the raid, and the Indians were furious. And they told John Williams, "You tell your people, if anyone else tries to escape, we're going to kill all of you. We're going to burn you with the stake. We're going to kill you with tomahawks. We're going to stab you to death." And Williams told his people, "Look, they've given us the warning. If anyone else tries this, it could kill all of us." And so no one of them knew during that march if a minute later someone was going to kill them with a tomahawk or a war club. The war club, by the way, was the most dangerous weapon on the early frontier, much more than a tomahawk. A war club essentially was a carved burl piece of wood with the heavily weighted burl of the wood at one end of the club, carved beautifully, very elegantly looking. And being hit with a war club was being hit with a baseball bat wielded by someone like Babe Ruth. It could cause instant death. The colonists refer to it as being knocked by a war club, which means being hit in the head by a war club, either concussions or fractured skulls. And I've held war clubs from the 1600s in my hand, and they can do tremendous damage. I mean, they're weighted and balanced so perfectly to deliver a tremendous blow.
Oof.
And so the people didn't know they might be tomahawked or war clubbed to death at any moment during this march back to Canada.
So you say that you're fascinated by moments in time that change American history, that everything is different afterwards. How did word of this spread, and what was the impact of this raid?
Well, word spread pretty quickly throughout New England. It has always spread during a great massacre or a raid on a town. and it made John Williams into a legend. Uh, that's one first result of it. He kept the faith, he kept his people together, and he decided to return to Deerfield. He sailed from Canada to Boston. He received a hero's welcome there. An oil painting was commissioned of him. And one of my favorite parts of my book is I've got a great color section of 16 or 20 pages with dozens of color pictures of the artwork and photographs and
I just
relics.
have I just have the advanced reader copy. So
Oh, yeah, you've got to get your hands on the real book because
yeah.
it has great artwork in it. And so one of the consequences was John Williams became a great hero and a great legend who kept the faith and survived, and a famous author for writing the book. Another one of the consequences was Deerfield became legendary. Word spread of what had happened, and then Deerfield rebuilt itself. That was an important contribution to the myth of Deerfield too. They went back, though there was still danger of more Indian attacks, and raids happened for the next 20 years. Williams and his fellow townspeople went back and reconstituted the town. So Deerfield became a symbol of the errand into the wilderness, the resilience of the hardy New England people to survive, and ultimately it came to represent the triumph of the white colonists against the natives. The Deerfield Massacre was a great victory for the Indians and the French. Uh, it accomplished what they wanted. They destroyed the town, they killed a lot of people, they took a lot of captives. But ultimately, in history, it was the white colonists who prevailed and who drove the Indians from the land. And only later, when the Indians were gone, and a great historian of early Deerfield, John Sheldon, really erased the Indians from the history of this episode. And when people thought they were safe and there were no more Indian raids, then they appropriated Indian imagery for commercial products, for books, for reenactments. Thomas Edison made a film of Bloody Brook Massacre and made a film of the Deerfield Massacre and turned the Indians into servants and slaves and loyalists to the white men. So a topsy-turvy happened where the Deerfield Massacre became a symbol of colonial triumphalism and not sad defeat. Deerfield appropriated the story of the massacre to make Deerfield into a tourist attraction uh, in the 1890s through the present day. And so it had many meanings and many consequences.
Why do you think we forgot? Why do you think this is the first I'm hearing about? Maybe I'm just not well read enough, but why do you think we forgot?
Well, you're right. It has been forgotten. I think there are a few reasons. One, this was a vast, early, unknown New England, far removed from the time of the Revolutionary War. When we think of New England, we think of George Washington crossing the Delaware. We think of Ben Franklin and his kite. We think of the elegance of Boston and New York, or the Tories being driven out. And so we think of more modern New England and revolutionary America. Deerfield was a frightening, dangerous, and mysterious place. People still believed in witchcraft. The Salem witchcraft trials happened only a few years before
Yeah,
the
right. Just
Deerfield.
20 years. Yeah. 10 years.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and that's also one reason why that a horseshoe hung above the old Indian door, not for luck, because the myth was a witch could not pass under iron, and that's why the hex marks are etched into the lock of the old Indian door. There are hex marks in there to keep the witches out, and so people were superstitious, they were terrified, people were being kidnapped, they would vanish, and so that was so far removed from the more modern era of the American Revolution. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson would not have recognized life in Deerfield. They were different creatures than the
Mm.
people who lived in Deerfield. And
So,
that's why one of the main reasons why we've forgotten it.
mm. So what can we use from the lessons of this story to make our own lives better today? What can we use as we look at a divisive presidential election, and there's all these different issues going on. There's climate change and there's violence and there's a lot of things that rightfully so make people really really nervous about what's going on around them. How can we take the lesson of what happened in Deerfield in 1704 and apply it to US of A in 2024?
Well, I think one way to do it is to consider the principles that these people fought and died for, and that Reverend Williams stood for. Uh, he was a man of great faith, great honor, loyalty to friends, loyalty to community, loyal to his faith, loyal to his principles. And those connect to a lot of the founding principles of America. What was the purpose of all this? Why found these colonies? Why immigrate to America? For a better life, and also for reasons of honor, democracy, freedom. Many of the early founding principles of America emerged from the New England towns, representative government, and we should remember how important these things were to the people who lived in Deerfield and how important they were to Reverend Williams. This allowed them to survive. Uh, Principles of family, faith, fidelity, honor, community, friendship, sacrifice.
I think
And to
also
see what,
oh, go ahead. Yeah,
no,
I
you
think
go
one
ahead. Go
important
ahead.
thing, I think one important thing is also freedom from fear, right? How afraid
Yes.
would you be if you knew that there was a native group or any group that was, coming with guns into your neighborhood or into my neighborhood or anyone's neighborhood? And, frankly, there are people who live with that fear every day. We have fears of mass shootings that are, happening all the time. To me, that seems like a really good parallel.
And also the parallel of what happened in Israel and Hamas and
And
Gaza.
hostages, yeah.
A surprise and stunning attack, vicious killings and torture, taking of hostages, now negotiating for the return of the hostages, just as happened in Deerfield. So there are a number of modern parallels.
If you could design a monument to the people who were lost that day and to the entire incident, what would that monument look like? And where would you place it? I guess on the street, right? It's got to be on the street.
Yeah. Well, there are there are a few monuments. I'll describe what a few of them are. Uh, they're huge boulders scattered throughout town with brass plaques on them or bronze plaques that designate the original locations of some of these houses that became famous in the attack. Then, in the old burying ground itself, there's a big grass-covered mound of earth, and that has a little gray or brown stone on it that says 1704. For a century, the myth was the survivors of the massacre were buried in a mass grave on this mound. And then later, in colonial times, in colonial revival times, this stone was put there. Well, it turns out that that's probably false. Uh, Ground penetrating radar has shown that it seems no one is ever buried under that mound. And one of the great mysteries of the massacre was, where were all the dead taken? The myth is they were sometimes put in caves near the river because it was freezing out and they could be preserved. And so I've gone through all the records that I could find that describe what happened that night, how people were buried, who was burned alive in this house or smothered in that house. I've found no contemporary source that says what was done with the dead of the Deerfield Massacre. It's one of the great mysteries. What happened to them? For a long time, their monument was thought to be this grassy mound of earth um, next door to one of the buildings of the Deerfield Academy in the burying ground. If if I had to put up a monument, I might put it near the Deerfield River, where it might be likely that the captors were taken across the river. Because when they went on that journey and they crossed that river, they did not know when, if ever, they would return. So I'd like to create some monument that symbolizes their hopes, their fears, and their hope of returning home, um, to recreate the town and live again and survive this nightmare.
You dedicated the book to your parents, and you say they set you on the road to Deerfield a long time ago. What did that mean?
Well, I grew up in a family of storytellers. My grandmother, my mother's mother, worked for the old Chicago newspapers and the tail end of that front page era. And she told me wild stories when I was a child. My favorite is, Jamie, did you know that during the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, a madman doctor murdered 100 girls and dissolved their bodies in acid? I was 6 years old at the time. My mother,
Lovely.
my mother said, well, and of course that's Dr. Holmes from the the I forgot the name of the book, the Eric Larson book about that Dr. H. Holmes.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
The Devil in the White City.
I read that. Yeah.
And my mother said, well, he didn't know until you told him. And then my father went to Lane Tech High School in Chicago, which was the high school attended by one of the 8 Nazi saboteurs, Herbert Hans Haupt, who landed by U-boat on the eastern shores of America and was later captured and electrocuted. And my father told me that story. And we used to go to an old Swedish restaurant on Belmont Avenue, and there was a Asian gift shop next door. He said, "Go into that shop with me. Here's $1. Buy something from that shop. Buy something from the woman behind the counter, and I'll tell you why you did that." So I bought a little china figure of a tiger and bought it and talked to the woman. My father said, "You just met Tokyo Rose, who was one of the women who broadcast propaganda against American soldiers in World War II. There are actually several Tokyo. This was Rose Taguri. So I met her. And my grandfather was a Chicago cop from the 1930s to the 1960s, the Al Capone era through the civil rights and Vietnam protest era. And one night he came home and said, "Don't let Jamie read the newspapers." Well, that began my lifelong habit of reading newspapers. I still get the real papers almost every day. The New York Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all of them. And so, of course, I looked at the papers that night, and the headline said, "Madman slaughters 8 student nurses." That was the notorious Chicago killer, Richard
Right.
Speck. So I grew up hearing these wild stories from my grandparents and from my parents. And then, more so, I was born on Lincoln's birthday in Chicago, and my parents took me to museums and Lincoln's home in Springfield. And my father took me to Gettysburg when I was 12 and bought me a Civil War sword. He bought me my first Abraham Lincoln autograph when I was 13 years old. So I was raised in this family that loves history, artifacts, documents. So that's what I meant when I said they set me on the path that led me to Deerfield.
So cool. What should we be excited about when it comes to the Apple series Manhunt?
Well, we have a great set of actors. Tobias Menzies from Outlander and The Crown plays Secretary of War Stanton. He did this fabulous job. And Patton Oswalt is hilarious, but great as one of the detectives hunting for John Wilkes Booth.
So that's what
We have
this
a
is, right? It's the chase for Lincoln's killer. Is
it's
that right?
all day chase
Yeah.
for Lincoln's killer, yes. Because Secretary of War Stanton is an overlooked hero in American history who should be remembered. He was Lincoln's great partner in winning the war. And when Lincoln was assassinated, he had to conduct the investigation of the murder. He had to organize the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. He had to continue fighting and winning the Civil War because the war wasn't fully over yet. And so Stanton is one of the great unsung heroes of American history. So Tobias does a great job playing him. Our Abraham Lincoln is fantastic. Hamish Linklater. And I've known several Abraham Lincolns. I knew Gregory Peck. I met him in his house. We talked about Lincoln. I've known Sam Waterston, who also is a great Abraham Lincoln. I met Hal Holbrook. And Hamish Linklater is Abraham Lincoln. I remember on the set, we filmed a lot of this in Savannah. And I met Hamish for the first time. We had dinner. And he said, "I've been nervous about meeting you." I said, "Why, Hamish?" He said, "Well, you're the great expert on Lincoln in the story." And I was just so terrified that you were going to say I was awful. I said, "Hamish, I've known Peck, I've known Waterston, I've met Hal Holbrook, I've seen the other Lincolns." Uh, Liam Neeson was originally cast as Lincoln in the Spielberg movie. And Liam showed me his Lincoln accent in my house. And I said, "You're as good as any of them. You are Abraham Lincoln. Remember, as you film the rest of the series, you are Abraham Lincoln. You've convinced me." He said, "Thank God, I'm so relieved." So Lily Taylor is Mary Lincoln, and a great actress, plays one of the slaves of Dr. Mudd, who set Booth's. Lovey Simone is a great actress who plays one of Dr. Mudd's slaves, and he's the man who set Booth's broken leg. So it really captures the danger and vibe of the catastrophe of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Uh, it was the worst event to happen in America since the Revolutionary War. Imagine how you felt after 9/11, the Kennedy assassination. Multiply all that. That's how America was reeling after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I think our miniseries, it's 7 parts, 7 hours, really captures what it was like to be in America during these tumultuous times. So I really enjoy it. I've seen it now
When
5.
when is it out yet?
The first 2 episodes will premiere on Apple TV on March 15th.
Good.
And then
Okay.
once a week after that, the next episodes will show.
Can't wait. Do you have any idea what book is going to, well, sorry, do you have any idea of what book you're going to do next? Have you thought at all about what the next seminal moment in American history you want to tackle is?
I've thought about it, but I can't say yet. But I will say it's a great story of Black American history. That was my main thing in college. I was a protege of John Hope Franklin, the great author of From Slavery to Freedom, which has sold millions of copies. And so I'm doing a book about something we've talked about for a long time. He died recently in his 90s, but he was a great inspiration to me. And he's the one who signed my application to have a Deerfield Fellowship and live in Deerfield in the summer and study Deerfield history. So aside from my parents and my grandparents, it was really John Hope Franklin who set me on this path.
Mm.
So I'm trying to write about a great unknown African American story.
Cool. James Swanson, the author of The Deerfield Massacre, A Surprise Attack, A Forced March, and the Fight for Survival in Early America. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Check out the book. Check out his social media feed on the website formerly known as Twitter at James L. Swanson. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.